The wood of the rocking chair groaned a familiar, rhythmic song against the porch boards, a sound that had echoed across Pine Meadow Ridge for 75 years. Silas Grandpa Vance sat with a glass of sweetened tea in his weathered hand, his eyes tracking the flight of a hawk circling the valley below. The cabin wasn't just a structure of hand-hewn cedar and riverstone, it was a living record. Silas's grandfather had cleared the timber in 1948. His father had survived the blizzard of '78 within these walls. Silas himself had raised 3 children here, teaching them that the land didn't belong to them so much as they belonged to the land. It was a sanctuary of rugged independence, sitting on a high promontory that ignored the encroaching world of subdivisions and strip malls. But the world, specifically in the form of Mara Sutter, was no longer content to be ignored.
The paper war.
The first letter had arrived in a crisp, white envelope that looked out of place in Silas's rusted mailbox. Official notice: Pine Meadow Ridge Estates HOA. Property Audit 09-12. Attention property owner, your residence has been identified as a non-conforming enclave. Under the Expansion Act of the HOA Charter, you are hereby ordered to register your deed with the association and pay the initial integration fee of $5,000. Silas had chuckled, the sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement.
He knew his history.
He held the original patent for this land. His property was an island of private forest, completely surrounded by public land and the sprawling beige-tinted development known as Pine Meadow Ridge Estates. He wasn't part of their collective, and he never would be. He used the letter to start the kindling for his wood stove. But Mara Sutter was not a woman accustomed to being used as kindling. As the president of the neighboring HOA, she saw Silas's 20 acres of prime ridgeline as the crown jewel of her planned Phase 4 expansion. To her, Silas wasn't a man, he was an obstacle in a flannel shirt. The letters became more frequent, and more delusional. They pivoted from invitations to demands. They claimed Silas's woodpile was a fire hazard, his well was tapping into HOA-managed aquifers, and his gravel driveway violated aesthetic uniformity. Then, the compliance officers arrived. Silas was splitting wood when the black SUV pulled up to his gate.
2 men stepped out.
They were dressed in charcoal gray tactical pants and black vests with high-visibility patches that read, PMRE HOA, Enforcement and Compliance. They looked like SWAT team rejects. They carried heavy flashlights, oversized batons, and wore body cameras that weren't turned on. "You the owner?" the lead man asked, his thumbs hooked into his vest. He had a neck tattoo and a sneer that suggested he enjoyed the weight of his authority. "I am," Silas said, resting his axe on the stump.
"And you're trespassing.
Gate says no soliciting, no trespassing, and private property. Which one did you have trouble reading?" "We're here on behalf of President Sutter," the man said, stepping onto the grass. "We're conducting a mandatory environmental impact inspection. We have reports of illegal chemical storage. If you don't cooperate, the HOA has the authority to initiate asset forfeiture to cover the costs of remediation." "The HOA has the authority of a book club in a trailer park," Silas replied calmly. "You've got 30 seconds to get back in that truck and drive back down the mountain. After that, I stop being polite." The man reached for a pair of handcuffs on his belt. "You're interfering with an official." Silas didn't shout.
He didn't even move fast.
He just picked up the heavy splitting maul and slammed it into the dirt with a force that made the ground tremble.
"Off my land."
The men retreated, but Silas saw them taking photos of his cabin and his shed. He knew this wasn't over. Mara Sutter didn't want compliance, she wanted the ridge. Mara Sutter was a woman who lived in a world of manufactured reality. In her mind, the HOA was a sovereign state, and she was its supreme ruler. When her officers reported Silas's defiance, she didn't see a man defending his home, she saw an insurgent. She convened a closed-door emergency session of her hand-picked board. She convinced them that Silas's property was a public safety crisis that threatened the property values of every home in the valley. Under the guise of protective enforcement, she authorized a tactical entry. The sun was just beginning to burn through the morning mist on Thursday when the piece of the ridge was shattered. Silas was in the kitchen, pouring a second cup of coffee, when he heard the roar of a heavy engine and the screaming of metal. He looked out the window to see a white pickup truck, spray-painted with the HLA logo, crashing through his heavy timber gate. The truck didn't stop until it was 20 feet from his porch.
3 men jumped out.
They weren't just wearing vests this time. They were wearing balaclavas, and they were armed. 2 carried semi-automatic handguns. The third, the man with the neck tattoo, carried a tactical shotgun. They moved with a practiced, aggressive posture, the kind of tactical LARPing common among men who wanted the power of a badge without the burden of the law.
Enforcement.
Get on the ground. the man with the shotgun screamed, leveling the barrel at Silas's front door. Silas didn't panic. He had been a young man in the jungles of Vietnam. He knew the difference between a real soldier and a bully with a toy. He reached behind the door and grabbed his old Remington 870, the same gun his father had used to keep coyotes away from the livestock.
He stepped onto the porch.
He didn't raise the gun yet. He stood tall, the morning light catching the silver in his hair. "You men are committing an armed home invasion," Silas said, his voice carrying across the clearing. "This is your final warning. Drop the weapons and leave the property.
Now.
Sign the papers, old man." The neck-tattooed man yelled, reaching into his vest to pull out a crumpled legal document. "Sign the joinder, or we take the house by force." The men began to advance, spreading out in a flanking maneuver. They were 30 feet away.
25.
"Drop it!" the man on the left screamed, raising his pistol. The moment the man's finger tightened on the trigger of his handgun, the world slowed down for Silas. It wasn't about land anymore. It wasn't about the HOA. It was about survival. Silas fired. The roar of the 12-gauge echoed off the granite cliffs. The lead attacker, the one with the shotgun, was hit squarely in the chest and thrown backward against the HOA truck. The man on the left, caught in the spread, went down clutching his leg, screaming in agony. The third man, the driver who had been lagging behind, saw his commander go down and immediately dropped his pistol into the dirt, falling to his knees with his hands locked behind his head.
"Don't shoot. Don't shoot. She said you wouldn't fight back," he wailed.
Silas kept his bead on the surviving gunman until the sound of distant sirens began to wail up the mountain road. The scene that greeted the county sheriff's deputies was something out of a low-budget action movie. A destroyed gate, a blood-stained truck, and a 78-year-old man sitting on his porch with his shotgun across his lap, waiting for the real law to arrive. The investigation didn't take long. The surviving gunman, a man named Miller, started talking before he even reached the back of the patrol car. He told the deputies everything. He spoke of General Sutter and her briefings in the HOA clubhouse. He talked about how she had promised them $10,000 each to secure the ridge, and how she had assured them that because she had friends in the county, any violence would be swept under the rug as a justified enforcement action. When the investigators searched the HOA offices, they found the smoking gun, a detailed map of Silas's property with Phase 4 luxury condos, already sketched over his cabin's location. They found the fraudulent notices and evidence that Mara had been skimming HOA dues to pay her security force in cash. Mara Sutter was arrested at her Gulfside villa that afternoon. She was still wearing her president name tag when they put her in the back of the cruiser. She screamed about due process and property rights until the door slammed shut. The verdict. The legal system, often slow, moved with surprising speed when faced with such an egregious abuse of power.
The trial of Mara Sutter.
The prosecution laid out a case of organized criminal usurpation. They proved that Mara had intentionally used the HOA as a front for a land theft ring. Because her orders had directly led to the death of one of her enforcers during the commission of a felony, the armed trespass, she was held responsible for the fatality. Sentence: Mara Sutter was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, armed trespass, attempted grand theft of real property, and impersonating a law enforcement agency. The judge, disgusted by her lack of remorse, sentenced her to 43 years in state prison. Fines: her personal assets were seized to pay a $2.5 million fine, which was distributed among the victims of her previous HOA fine schemes. The HOA, the Pine Meadow Ridge Estates HOA, was legally dissolved by a court order, its remaining assets liquidated and its governing documents declared null and void. The survivor, Miller, for his cooperation, he received 10 years for armed trespass and conspiracy. The wounded gunman, after recovering from his injuries, he was sentenced to 15 years.
The homeowner.
The district attorney didn't even consider charges against Silas Vance. In this state, the DA told the press, a man's home is his castle. When armed men crash through a gate and point guns at a citizen on his own porch, that citizen has every right to ensure they don't do it again. 3 months later, the ridge was quiet again. The HOA truck had been towed away and crushed for scrap. A new gate, sturdier than the last, stood at the entrance of the driveway. Silas sat in his rocking chair, the groaning of the wood a comforting rhythm in the evening air. A car pulled up, not a black SUV, but a modest sedan. A young couple, former residents of the now-dissolved HOA, stepped out. They weren't there to serve a notice. They were carrying a basket of peaches. "We just wanted to say thank you, Mr. Vance," the woman said. "For a long time, we were afraid to even paint our front door. You showed us that nobody owns our lives but us." Silas accepted the peaches with a nod. "Just keep your gates closed and your eyes open, folks. The world's full of people who think they know how to run your life better than you do. You just have to remind them that no is a complete sentence. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold, Silas Vance took a sip of his tea. The hawk was gone, tucked away in its nest. The ridge was peaceful. The third generation of Vances still held the land, and the fourth was already learning the song of the rocking chair. The HOA was a memory. The mountain was forever.